The year is 2005. You're 15 years old and you've got exactly $80 of birthday money burning a hole in the pocket of your cargo shorts. You're on a mission. You need a generic MP3 player because you can't afford an iPod, and you need a stack of blank verbatim DVDs to burn some data that you definitely obtained legally. You stand in the humid heat of a Queensland Saturday morning and weigh your options. To your left is Harvey Norman. Harvey Norman is where your dad buys a fridge. It's quiet, carpeted, and the sales guys wear ties and look at you like you're about to shoplift. To your right is JB Hi-Fi. It's cool, sure, and it smells like texture fumes and sweat, but it's cramped, usually hidden in a basement, and you have to fight through a mosh pit of grunge fans just to see the CD rack. Then you look straight ahead. You see a massive industrial warehouse stamped with a logo that screams at you from the car park.
Wow, sight and sound. TV, CD, PC, mobiles, car, audio, and security. Expert advice, best brands you like, the wicked deals we've got. Digital surround sound, home theater, get down. Something for the home office you know you want. Expert advice, best brands you like, the wicked deals we've got. Wow, sight and sound.
Wow, sight and sound. You walk through the automatic doors and the air conditioning hits you like a physical wall. The music's blasting, the aisles are wide, and there's rows of silver flat screen TVs stretching out like a runway. The sheer scale of the place told you everything you needed to know about the economy. We were living through a gold rush. The bulky, grey CRT televisions of our childhoods were finally dying. In their place, everyone was desperate for the new gods of the living room, plasma and LCD. For a retailer, losing money in this era seemed impossible. You just had to open the doors, stack the boxes high, and watch the cash register sing. Standing under those fluorescent lights, it felt like this empire would last forever. But you were wrong. While you're deciding between the 128 megabyte player and the 256, the men in the back office are making decisions that will turn this place into dust. To the outside world, WoW was a thriving giant sponsoring NRL teams and bullying the competition, but behind the shelves of discounted video games, the company was rotting. They were building a financial trap that would snap shut just 7 years later. This is the story of WoW Sight and Sound, the retail giant that was too big, too loud, and too arrogant to fail until it did. To understand why WoW failed, you first have to understand the specific arrogance of its business model. The company was born in Townsville, North Queensland in 2003, and the founders, Sam Savas and Suds Sotiris, weren't interested in starting a small local business. From day one, they were chasing the American concept of the category killer. In the early 2000s, the prevailing wisdom in retail was that bigger is better. The theory was that if you build a store that's physically larger than your competitors, you can stock more products, and if you stock more products, you become a destination. People will drive past the small local shops to come to you because they know you'll have exactly what they need. WoW Sight and Sound took this philosophy and applied it to the Australian electronics market with zero restraint. They sold TVs and stereos, yes, but they also had car audio systems, navigation units, CB radios, musical instruments, and a massive library of DVDs and CDs. They wanted to be the alpha and omega of entertainment. And for a while, it worked. Now, the geography of their birth is important here. By starting in Townsville and expanding through regional Queensland, in places like Cairns, Mackay, and Darwin, they faced less immediate competition than they would have in the saturated markets of Sydney or Melbourne. They also swooped in at just the right time to capture the boomtown money. Queensland was riding the mining boom and flush with cash. The Australians here were looking for places to spend it, and WoW proved a metropolitan-style shopping experience in towns that felt ignored by the big city retailers. They even had a ticketing partnership. In many regional towns, WoW Sight and Sound was the physical location for Ticketek. If you wanted to see a concert in Brisbane or Sydney, you had to physically walk into a WoW store to print your tickets. This was a brilliant foot traffic driver. It forced thousands of young, cash-rich music fans to walk past rows of iPods and car subwoofers just to pick up their tickets. It created a cool factor that Harvey Norman, with its focus on washing machines and recliners, could never replicate. By 2010, WoW Sight and Sound had decided they were ready for the big leagues. they pushed south, opening stores in New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT. They were now a national brand. To cement this status, they signed a massive sponsorship deal with the Brisbane Broncos, putting the yellow WOW logo on the chest of NRL superstars and beaming it to millions of living rooms every Friday night. This was the peak of their empire, but it was also the moment they walked directly into the firing line of the most efficient retailer in Australian history, JB Hi-Fi. The war between WOW and JB Hi-Fi is the most important lesson in this story. It's a perfect case study in vanity versus sanity, and WOW Sight and Sound was built on vanity. Their stores were designed to impress. They were spacious, well lit, and branded within an inch of their life. They paid for prime real estate, expensive fit-outs, and that massive Broncos sponsorship. They wanted to be the premium option. JB Hi-Fi was built on sanity. If you look at JB Hi-Fi's financial reports from this era, they were obsessed with one metric: cost of doing business. JB didn't care if their stores looked messy. In fact, the mess was part of the strategy. They used handwritten signs because handwritten signs psychologically signaled bargain to a customer. They crammed stock into every square inch of floor space, minimizing their rent per product. They operated with a ruthless efficiency that kept their expenses lower than almost any other listed retailer in the world. WOW tried to beat JB Hi-Fi by being nicer. But when the global financial crisis finally started to bite the Australian consumer in 2011, nice became a liability. The Australian dollar hit parity with the US dollar, and suddenly, retail changed forever. Customers would walk into a WOW store, look at the camera, and then pull out their phone to buy it significantly cheaper from a US website. In this brutal new environment, you could only survive if you were the cheapest or the most convenient. JB Hi-Fi could afford to slash prices because their overheads were so low. WOW Sight and Sound, with their massive rents and expensive marketing deals, couldn't. They were trapped in a premium body in a discount world. But bad sales figures don't usually kill a company overnight. Retailers have bad years all the time. They cut costs, close a few stores, and restructure. WOW Sight and Sound should have been able to survive the downturn of 2011, and the reason they didn't is where this story gets messy. The founders, Sam Savas and Sud Sotiris, decided that being successful retailers qualified them to be property moguls. They established a separate company called the SSI Group and a subsidiary called Aristicon. Records show that WOW Sight and Sound had lent approximately $20 million to Aristicon. Think about that for a second. An electronics retailer, which operates on razor-thin margins and needs cash to buy inventory, took $20 million of its working capital and handed it to a property developer. It was a gamble that relied on the Queensland property market continuing to boom. But in 2010, that market collapsed. As a result, Aristicon and the SSI Group were placed into receivership. The property empire had failed. And when Aristicon collapsed, that $20 million debt to WOW Sight and Sound became a bad debt. Aristicon had no money to pay it back. Overnight, WOW Sight and Sound had a $20 million hole blown in its battle sheet. Management tried to spin this furiously. They issued press releases stating that WOW was completely separate from the property issues. They claimed the retail business was profitable and trading strongly. Technically, they were right. The retail business was a separate legal entity. But you can't remove $20 million of liquidity from a low-margin retailer in the middle of a recession and expect it to survive. By early 2012, they owed $25 million to the National Australia Bank and another $25 million to unsecured creditors, like the suppliers who sent them TVs, games, and fridges. When the end finally came on February 27, 2012, it triggered one of the most chaotic episodes in Australian insolvency history. And this is where we need to talk about the Personal Property Securities Act, or PPSA. I know Personal Property Securities Act sounds like the most boring combination of words in the English language, but in 2012, this specific law was a weapon that destroyed dozens of small businesses. Here's how it worked. For decades, business in Australia operated on a retention of title system. If I'm a supplier and I send you 50 Samsung TVs on credit, I own those TVs until you pay me. If you go bankrupt before paying me, I can come to your warehouse, point at the TVs and say, "Those are mine," and take them back. But on January 12, 2012, just 4 weeks before WoW collapsed, the government changed the rules. They introduced the PPSA. Under the new law, retention of title clauses in contracts were no longer enough. If you wanted to claim your TVs back, you had to have registered your interest on this new government website. If you didn't register and the retailer went bust, you lost your title. The TVs didn't belong to you anymore. They belonged to the pool of assets to be sold off by the bank. WoW Sight and Sound was the first major collapse after this new law came into force. When the receivers, Ferrier Hodgson, took control of the stores, suppliers rushed to the loading docks to reclaim their unpaid stocks. They had trucks waiting and contracts proving they owned the goods. But the receivers blocked the doors. They asked a simple question: did you register on the PPSA? For many suppliers, the answer was, what in the bloody hell is the PPSA? The receivers then legally seized millions of dollars worth of stock that had not been paid for. Small distributors who had supplied WoW with accessories, cables, and games watched helplessly as their stock was locked inside the stores to be sold off to pay to the bank. The final week of WoW Sight and Sound was a grim spectacle. The receivers spent roughly 9 days trying to find a buyer. They frantically called competitors and private equity firms, trying to offload the network of 15 stores. But nobody wanted it. The receivers admitted later that while there were 2 or 3 interested parties, the offers were so low that it made more sense just to liquidate everything. On March 8, 2012, the order was given to kill the company. All 15 stores were closed immediately and 580 staff were fired on the spot.
And nearly 600 people will be out of work with the collapse of the Australian WoW retail chain. Receivers were appointed last week, with the company owing $25 million.
The going out of business sales that followed were chaotic. In places like Annerley and Townsville, crowds descended to pick over the carcass. Shoppers reported a strange atmosphere inside the stores. The music was still playing, the bright yellow branding was still screaming "wow" from every wall, but the shelves were being stripped bare by bargain hunters while 580 people had just lost their livelihoods. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the physical presence of WoW Sight and Sound vanished. But in the digital age, dead brands rarely stay dead. Just months after the liquidation, in May 2012, a press release announced that WoW Sight and Sound was back. A company called G&M Direct to You had purchased the intellectual property from the receivers. They relaunched WoW as an online entertainment superstore, promising to deliver the same experience without the burden of physical stores. It was a classic zombie brand strategy. We see this all the time in retail. Think of Dick Smith or Toys R Us. An investor buys the husk of a famous name, hoping that the lingering consumer recognition will drive traffic to a generic e-commerce site. For a while, it seemed to limp along. The new owners kept the website running, selling a mix of DVDs and games, and they even tried to maintain the cheeky tone of the original brand and social media, but the soul was dead and gone. The magic of WoW was the physical imposition of the store. It was the cold air conditioning on a hot day, a specific chaotic energy of a Saturday morning in Townsville. A website with a checkout now button just couldn't replicate that. Slowly, the zombie version of WoW faded into obscurity. The social media posts stopped and the website traffic dwindled. By 2019, the domain finally went dark, marking the true final death of the brand. The collapse of WoW Sight and Sound was the first domino in what would become a decade of pain for Australian retail. In the years that followed, we watched the fall of Dick Smith Electronics, the collapse of Game, and the slow death of the department store. But WoW remains the most colourful tragedy of them all. It serves as a permanent case study in the dangers of hubris. The founders thought they could beat JB Hi-Fi by having nicer floors, and they thought they could beat the property market by using their retail cash flow as a betting slip. They were wrong on all 3 counts. Today, if you drive past those old bulky goods centres in Queensland, the buildings are still there. They're occupied by Rebel Sport or Supercheap Auto or even JB Hi-Fi. But if you look closely at the facade, sometimes you can still see the faint outline of where that massive yellow sign used to be. But what do you think? Do you remember walking into a WoW Sight and Sound? Did you buy one of those View TVs? And looking back, do you think the superstore model can ever work again? Or are we destined to buy everything from a warehouse robot? Let me know all that and more in the comment section below, guys. And as always, thank you so much for watching and stay curious.